I'm Andre Stringer, and this is
Tracy Chandler.
And I'm creative director and co-founder,
Executive producer and co-founder
of Shilo. And we also have a new venture called WMIG, which is a sort of a writing and concepting company as well. The easiest way to understand Shilo is we're like a traditional production company for the most part, but we've come at it from a very untraditional sort of way. So we sort of blend the concept of a production company and a director, and you sort of mash them all up into one thing. We tend to approach work from the very inception in a more collaborative sort of way. We utilize such a wide diversity of talents, and by doing that you really get a broader palette. Like, you're able to use a lot more different tools to finally bring a vision. So I think we love to think that every piece of work that we try to do has that a strong point of view, a strong authored point of view, but it's informed by quite a lot of people, and I think that rather than it being like one singular vision of one person, I think we always thought of that as sort of limiting. All of us, we can think, we're a very imaginative person. If you take one of us and sort of put us in that role, we could do it, but we do it much better as a sum of the parts rather than just by ourselves.
Executionally, we do more mixed media. It involves anything from claymation to design to animation to 3D. We're kind of all over the place, and so I think coming at work from a much broader way executionally involves a much more complicated team, and so our company is based on having directors and having people with vision and leadership, but also collaborating the whole way through with artists, illustrators, technical people that can kind of figure out crazy workflows in 3D. It's a very collaborative process in order to get the vision from the beginning on screen at the end. And so our company is based on sort of having that kind of cohesion in a studio model with the leadership and the vision of a director.
I think because the traditional model has a tendency to pigeonhole. I think from a filmmaking point of view, from a commercial filmmaking point of view, the traditional model says there's a director, there's a post house, there's an editorial company, there's an advertising agency, there's all these, and each of them has their own stake in what they're making, and there's sort of always this fight against it.
And a very specific role to play.
Yeah, and I think that by sort of harnessing all those things and saying well, nowadays the guys who direct and are sometimes the guys who design, and the guys who direct are also sometimes the dudes who edit.
If a designer comes at directing something, they might have a different approach than a traditional director might have, and so it sort of comes out with a different product.
In the old traditional model, you're sort of regimented. You're a colorist, or you're very specific, and I think that level of excellence is very important. But I think a new point of view also branches out and says that anybody can do anything. You have a very powerful point of view when you look at it from that way, and that we can all sort of engage, and everybody's roles can be blended, and it's fun, and it's more fun that way. The most frustrating thing about making some of the stuff that you make when it's so regimented is that you don't get to, it's so limiting. You're sitting there and you're I have this idea, we need to see if it actually works. How do we figure out if it actually works, And is it something that so we just need to sketch this idea, And then what sketching ends up doing is facilitating a different way of making it. And I think that's really where the things start shaking up, because you start fucking with it and you're oh, here, and you go in and you start yelling, and then all of a sudden you have tracks and you're working with those, and you're okay, that's starting to sound interesting, and we have different layers of the music, and we're turning them on and off, all the different splits in the music. We're oh, is this cool? Is it better if it's just this ambient sound? Or is it drums? Da da da, And all that sort of starts bubbling out, and then you start yelling. You're in the sound booth, and then you're oh, I need to shoot. So we're shooting 16 to people reading books, you know, like, and we're, well, let's slug that in, and we're shooting pictures, and we're like, oh, this is going to be a cool card that we can do. And you start hybridizing it all together, and it's like, it's a lot less limiting.
That's part of our creative processes. We sort of like do a lot of the different places, the different parts of the machine ourselves or as a group here, and then, you know, and then we'll just do that as to lay it in as sort of a proof of concept. But when we do the final thing, we might go to an actual sound recording studio and record a professional voiceover talent. But in order to like just see if things are working and to vibe it out, we've got to kind of just do it ourselves first, you know. And so even with like color, you know, we work with the most amazing colorist, but at the same time, sometimes we'll just like do some like little tests here that just kind of, you know, see if things are looking better in a warmer look or a cooler look. You know, you kind of, we don't want to feel limited by having to work with the specialist and pay so much money and just to figure out even if the idea is working. We like to just like test it out and get our hands dirty ourselves to really see, you know, if something's going to work or not. And also just by the act of doing that, new ideas come up and the creative evolves, and it just sort of becomes so much more of an organic process. We do a lot of like group brainstorming where we sit down around a table together and we just like start throwing ideas out there. We do a lot of kind of visual exploration of ideas where we kind of draw these mind map charts where we're just like, well, what about this and what comes off of this? I think the magic is in that collaboration, is in working together to kind of come up with ideas or to change ideas or to test ideas. And sometimes that's sitting around a table, sometimes that's sitting in the edit suite, sometimes that's when we're out on a bike ride, sometimes that's when we're walking around the streets to go get lunch and we just see something on the street and we're like, oh, that's cool, we should write something about that. Everything is just building off of each other, and it's sort of that like vibe and that buzz of working as a group, and everybody gets hyped up, and it's like everyone's competing to get a word in because they're so excited, and everyone's just like rolling with it. And I think that like our clients, I mean, the people that we're working for, they get that back in the end product. All of that fun that we had as a group shows up in the film.
Yeah, it's like an explosive sort of like viscerality that just starts like popping off. Those are the most like fundamentally, when things happen the fastest, that's the most exciting parts. Those are the most magical parts, where things just start making sense really quickly.
There's less of the power being in the hands of the few, and it's much more in the hands of many because of the accessibility of desktop computers and all of the tools and being able to learn those tools. I think that it's much more accessible for anyone that has creative ideas to be able to express those ideas in multiple ways. It's not just pen and paper. It's like you can, you know, go learn compositing software and figure that out and, you know put that out there in a short film. I think there's so many different ways for people to express themselves because of the technology. It's added that.
A huge value is put on creative work now, which I think is really impressive because more people can touch it. So you see, like, oh, you know, the same way that everybody could cook, now everybody can make films. That's fantastic. And everybody, even, you know, the housewife or the mom or the dad or the, you know, the 3-year-old coming up is shooting their own videos. You know, it's fantastic.
The prolific nature of the time that we're in, and that there's so many more people making so much more content, also changes the context of how we view work. Because there's so much more stuff out there, and there's actually so much more lo-fi stuff out there. I mean, we're so used to looking at handycam stuff on YouTube that it sort of like changes the base of what people are used to seeing stuff in. So, I mean, if most of the time that people were viewing any sort of film content in the olden days was actually in a theater and a high production value film, now that it's just so much more to look at. What are people getting used to, and what are people liking? What feels comfortable for them to see? You know, it's sort of like the range is so huge from the most lo-fi thing to, you know, Avatar just came out, and that's sort of like the spectrum is so broad. It's actually kind of daunting to think of where does the work that I'm making fit in that context? You know, where does it fit on that kind of this like huge scale? Because there's so many more authors, creating content that my work has to fit in and compete with. I think people will look back at this time and think that it's a point of explosion. It's a point of explosion in the types of work that are being made, and the number of the amount of work that's being made, and the types of people that are making the work. I think before it was somewhat limited and focused, and I think that it's a point where it just blam, everything just opened up in terms of all types of things.